All right, good morning, everyone. Okay, now we are, I think we're 3 weeks in now. Yes, because I opened up this series, kind of give a little ground floor to set the stage. Pastor Neil picked it up last week and took us through chapter 37, and we are going to be looking at chapter 39 as we open up the text today. But before we do that, let me just say, we are talking about Joseph's story, whether you are here in this place right now, or maybe you're joining us via live stream, whatever it might be. We're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 39. And if you have your bulletin, you can grab that. If you have a Bible, I'd encourage you to open it up and let's look at it together. But before we jump into the text, I want to ask you the same question I just asked the kids. How do you respond when you fall down on your proverbial tuchuses? How do you respond? What is the first thing that you do? You know, when you find yourself in that place where things kind of fall apart on you. When the air conditioner that's supposed to be working, the central air, leaves you stranded, so to say, in the middle of the heat wave like it did to us last week. How do you respond? How do you do it? Like when maybe the car leaves you stranded on your way to vacation. How do you respond? How do you respond when the doctor calls with some unwelcomed news? Or, you just make it to the airport to watch your plane flying away. That happened to us too. Not a good feeling. How do you respond when a large bill shows up like an unexpected and uninvited party crasher and just throws everything upside down because the bank account's already flashing, warning, warning, warning? How do you respond to these things when you find yourself in these types of situations? Like maybe we see up on the screen, Christine. She went to sleep. Did you? No, she's awake. Okay. Like, do you feel like this? Now you can't see it, can you? There it is. All right. Like that camel who is about to have his back broke. If one more straw falls on it, and there's the hand dropping that last piece. My sister used to say, Doug, because when I would give her a little trouble, she would say, Doug, I have one last nerve and you're standing on it. And that's just right before she's about to explode on me. So I know to back off, to back away. How do you respond when you find yourself there? Like that camel is about to experience, the back is about to break. Do you scream out? Why? Do you get angry or potentially lose hope? Or do you blame somebody? Or do you just give up? I mean, there's different ways to respond, and different people will respond in different ways, right? Maybe you're the type of person that will do kind of like just the opposite. You will just kind of fix your eyes on your situation and work so diligently to climb back out of the pit, to figure it out, to fix your circumstances in your own power. However it is, how do you respond when things are not going in the direction that you expected they were going to go? And you find yourself in that place where it's upside down. However you respond, trouble will take its toll. It will affect us. It can play havoc with our attitudes, our dreams, our nerves. It is just the way that things will happen sometimes because we don't know what the future holds. We don't know what this next moment will hold. And just like that, we can find ourselves in the pit, in that place of unknowing. And these things that I kind of listed for you aren't even as bad as it could get. It can get a whole lot worse than that. I mean, Joseph's story, just consider it. Let's recap it from last week. whether you were here or not. So we kind of bring it up to this place that we're going to jump off of today. He's favored by his father, so much so that he gets to wear this really cool, colorful coat. Remember, right? The coat of many colors. And it sets him apart and distinct, and in fact, even above his other brothers. When he's the youngest, he should not have that place of prominence. Yet his father gives that to him because he's special. He's favored. So, while his other brothers get the grunt jobs, he gets the cushy jobs. It's just the way it is. And so naturally, his brothers resent him. In fact, the text tells us it's a little more than resent. They hated him. They hated him with a passion. And then to top it off, he tells them a couple really cool dreams, dreams that he received from God. The first one is something like this: all the brothers, you're going to bow down to me. And the second one is kind of like it: mom and dad will too. Eventually, at some point, you're all going to bow down to me. Isn't that cool? Not really. In fact, that makes them hate him even more. They despise him. So here he comes along to do, kind of check out where his brothers are and to report back to dad. And they say, oh, here comes that dreamer, right? I'm sure you pointed that out last week. And they devise this plan to get rid of him once and for all. And so down goes Joseph into the cistern head first. Or I don't know if it was head first. Remember, I said he landed on his tuchus. I don't know. I don't know how he fell in there. I just know that's where he ended up. They wanted to kill him. That's what they wanted. They hated him so much. But his oldest brother, Reuben, had different plans. He planned to save him and, come back later. So he said, look, let's just leave him in here. Don't kill him, and we'll be done with it that way. And he was going to come back and save him. But along come a band of Ishmaelites bound for Egypt. And so the brothers decide instead they're going to sell him, make a little profit, give them to the Ishmaelites. And those merchants will take him down to Egypt, and they will not only be rid of him, but they will walk away with a little pocket change. And so that is exactly what they did. And with that, Joseph goes from a place of prominence to the lowest position that he could have in their society. Joseph loses everything: the coat, the power, the position, the prestige, the cushy jobs, the great life. It was all taken from him in an instant. Can you relate to something like that? Maybe not to that extreme, but in somewhere along your journey so far, I guarantee you went from that place to another just like that, and you thought, oh my goodness, what just happened? The bottom dropped out. All was well, and now it's not. It's upside down. On one level, we may be able to relate to Joseph's story in that way. But listen now. Here are the questions that could go through Joseph's mind at a time like this. What about the dreams? I mean, God made a promise, and he said, I was going to be great. What about that? I was going to be a success. And here I am on my way, it would appear, to a life of slavery, to live out my life in a foreign land. What is going on? I was going to be a success, but at the present, it would appear that I am traveling down not the road to success, but the road to misery. To become a slave in a foreign land. This is where we pick it up, by the way, today. So turn with me again to your text, chapter 39. We're just going to read the first portion of this chapter, verses 1 through 6. We'll keep it short and sweet. But it begins here now, verse 1, chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Now, okay, so that's the situation. That's kind of the setting for what's going to come next in the Joseph story, right? But let's pause on that first verse long enough to kind of understand the context a little bit better. Joseph is now a servant or a slave, you could say, of course, in Potiphar's house. The text says that Potiphar is an Egyptian. Now, at first glance, that might seem a little strange. Why did Moses, the author that is, state the obvious? Of course, they're in Egypt, and Potiphar's in Egypt, so he's an Egyptian. I mean, it would just seem to make sense, right? Why did Moses tell us that he was an Egyptian? Well, Joseph's story may have taken place in a time where Egypt was not ruled by the Egyptian pharaohs. There's a possibility, in fact, it is many scholars, probably the majority, believe that it was at a time where they were ruled by foreign rulers. Scholars are divided on this, so let me make that clear. That's not everybody agrees with this, but there's a possibility, and let me kind of flesh it out with you, that the Joseph story took place in a time where they were ruled by what was called the Hyksos. The Hyksos. And the dates for Joseph's experience in Egypt aren't clear because there were no dates recorded in the Bible and no extra biblical sources to confirm one or the other. So it's kind of divided between one date or another. But most believe it was in the time of the Hyksos. And in Egyptian, Hyksos means foreign rulers. In the Greek, it means shepherd kings. So at this particular time, if in fact this is correct, that Joseph went there in this time where Egypt was upside down, well, then the Hyksos would have been ruling. And they date back, the Hyksos that is, or they are to be descendants of Canaan. Now, Canaan, of course, would eventually become the promised land. So, Canaanites are actually ruling the majority of Egypt. They took the majority of Egypt, the north, and left just a little bit at the bottom for the Egyptian pharaohs to still be in power. But it was very little power. The Hyksos were in control. So Moses may be clarifying that Potiphar was an Egyptian simply for his readers to understand that he was not connected to the Hyksos. Joseph will find no special favor in his house because he is enslaved by a true Egyptian, devoted to his land, to his king, and to his own gods. They couldn't be any further, any dissimilar. Here's Joseph, a Hebrew, coming from wealth and status, favor and power. That's what the coat that he previously wore meant. And he's a believer in the one true God, the God of the Bible, Yahweh. But he's now living as a slave in the house of Potiphar, who is an Egyptian, and not just any Egyptian. He's a high-ranking official of Pharaoh who is devoted to the gods of their religion and devoted to the protection of the Pharaoh, who, by the way, they believe are also going on to be gods in the pantheon of gods. That's what their belief was. And the text next states that Potiphar was one of Pharaoh's officials, and he was captain of the guard. That's like saying he was chief of police. Or maybe even better yet, that Potiphar was the head of Pharaoh's secret security force. He was highly trusted, had an important position in the government of Egypt, that is. So here are these two guys, Joseph and Potiphar can't be more different. Potiphar's name means devoted to the sun god Ra. And by the way, Joseph's name means the Lord shall add. So here they are, completely opposed. But at this present, it would appear that the Lord is not adding at all, not adding to Joseph's life, but taking away. Taking away. So let's just consider this. In this present situation that Joseph finds himself in, how could he respond to his new circumstances? I mean, I guess he could just give up the dream altogether. Well, I thought I was going to be great. I thought things were going to work out. I thought that these dreams that I received from God were going to come true, but man, I don't see that happening now. I am just going to give up. He could go a step further and he could get angry at God and blame him for his situation. You were the God that was supposed to add to me. You're the God that made the promise. What'd you do? Turn your back on me? Even David kind of prays that prayer. Don't turn your back on me. Stay with me, God. Even if my mother and father turn their back on me, please stay with me. He could have gotten angry at God and questioned God's integrity and goodness. People do that. He could have got angry at his brothers, and he could resent his new master and his miserable situation and live out the rest of his life enslaved to his ill feelings. Do you know anybody in that place? Or he could simply trust in God, even though things don't seem to make sense, even though the world seems to be turned upside down. He could trust in God. It's a choice. He could do it. The God who made the promise, just as his grandfather Abraham did. You remember that, right? Abraham, when he was first called Abram, before God gave him a new name, God called him out of the land of Ur, the land of false gods, and said, follow me. Just as Jesus did to Peter and Andrew and James and John, follow me. God says to Abraham, I want you to follow me, and I'm not going to tell you where you're going. Just pack everything up and follow me. I'm going to take you somewhere. Without details. But Abraham trusted the voice that he heard. And he followed him. And as we continue, it will be clear that Joseph chose to do the same. In fact, if he didn't, there would be no story of Joseph in the Bible to record, except for maybe something similar to a Judas story that turned his back on Jesus. But Joseph did not do that. We will see that Joseph chose to follow God regardless of where he was, to follow him even in the very footsteps of Abraham, his grandfather. And so he made the best of the situation while trusting in God and did everything as if he was doing it for the God he served. You know, we are called to do that, right? No matter what we do, we are to work as if we are working right for God, to serve him, no matter where we are in our situation, in our life. And so he made the best of his situation while trusting in God and did everything as if he was doing it for the God he served. And he may have been a servant in the house of Potiphar, but his greatest commitment was to serve God, the God he trusted, the God who made the promise. And so he did it to the best of his ability, putting his best foot forward. And you know what? It got noticed. It got noticed as we pick it up here in verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. You know, we often can complain to God that he put us in this terrible or difficult situation. Yet God's will is that we trust him, to bless us, to carry us through, to make us successful. And that's how, by the way, how he measures success might be very different than the way we measure success. But no matter what, he was there to trust God that he would be true to his word and make him a success wherever he was. Do you know, I'll tell you what, Joseph can sometimes look like a character larger than life. I think you brought up last week, didn't you? Like this character that we would look at and say, I could never do that. I could never respond that way. I don't have that in me. But Joseph was not larger than life. He was very, very human. In fact, one of the reasons he ended up in the pit was because he had a problem with pride. I mean, his dad set it up. He made him special. He told him he was better than the rest. He gave him better things. And so it went to his head. And so, while the dreams were true and God said, I do have a plan for you, he bragged about it. And he went to his brothers and, kind of taunted them, in a sense, with it. A little bit of arrogance going on there. So that might be one of the reasons why he ended up in the pit in the first place and as a slave. But God intended it. He allowed it. He permitted it to happen. Why? Because God wanted to turn him in to something that he could use later to do mighty things through. And Joseph needed some work. He needed to be humbled. So God let him fall. Sometimes God will let you fall. Not to hurt you, but so eventually he can say, now you look a little bit more like my son. Spurgeon has something to say about this situation. The great preacher Spurgeon, he says, externally, it did not always appear that God was with Joseph, for he did not always seem to be a prosperous man. But when you come to look into the inmost soul of the servant of God, you see his true likeness. He lived in communion with the Most High, and God blessed him. There's no doubt that Joseph loved God, but there's still things that had to go on in Joseph's life so that God could fulfill his great purpose in him. Some people think they can't be blessed unless they are in that perfect place. Well, where's my blessing? We could say. They even preach it from pulpits, right? If your life is not completely blessed, there's something wrong with your faith. Get it together. Doesn't always work that way. Some people think they can't be blessed unless they are in charge of something. Like in control, have a position that others will look at and say, oh man, look at that blessing. We do that sometimes, right? We look at other people and say, wow, do they have it together? And then we look at ourselves. But Jesus lived as an example and taught another way, a better way. Jesus taught the life of a servant. And how valuable it is to take on a servant's heart. And we know he did because he dropped himself to the lowest place in society, even to a slave himself. And he died the lowest death on a cross. And Jesus said to his disciples when they were trying to fight to climb up the ladder of success, to be something more important than the rest of them, because they all wanted it. They wanted that special seat in the house around the king's table when the kingdom was established. They were constantly fighting over it, but Jesus says, if you want to be great in God's kingdom, then what? You have to be a servant of all. You have to be willing to serve other people because that makes you great. You see, it seems like a paradox, but Jesus says the way to the top is to go to the bottom. This pyramid idea that we have in our society that, you work your way up and you climb usually on the shoulders of other people until you get to that one place that's only room for one person at the top of that pyramid. And that's where you find success. Jesus says, I turn that upside down. Success is not built on those who you rise above, but those who you lift up from that lowest point and serve them with a servant's heart. That's what will make you special in God's kingdom and important. For the Son, Jesus says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And he could have come and said, look, hey, do you know who I am? Serve me. But he didn't. He knelt down and washed the feet of his disciples when none of them were willing to do the same for him. And he didn't do it begrudgingly. He did it lovingly. And when we can understand the value of servanthood, even in the worst circumstances, good things can come from it. Blessings abound when we take on the heart of a servant. Verse 3 continues, when his master, of course, that's Joseph's master, Potiphar, that earthly master that he was connected to. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, verse 4, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. It wasn't that Potiphar didn't believe that Joseph's God was real. He did, because he believed in the pantheon of gods. He just didn't believe that it just wasn't his God. He had other gods that he followed and worshiped that were set up for him through that religious system that he followed in Egypt. But he was fully aware that Joseph was following a God as well. And again, when he saw that the Lord was with him in a mighty way, and that the Lord gave him success in everything that he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant, his personal attendant. So basically, Joseph had no position or connection to Potiphar and that household until after Potiphar said, boy, everything you do, everything you put your hand to works out. It's beneficial to bring you a little closer, to give you a little status. And this didn't happen overnight, even though the story is just a few minutes long if we read it straight through and I didn't keep babbling. This happened over time. Joseph had to be committed for the long haul, not knowing what the outcome would really be or how long it would take. And yet he did. He remained faithful. By his trust in God, by his diligent work and blessing from God, Joseph showed Potiphar that God was real to him. God was real. And that he was willing to follow God all the way to the end, no matter what, no matter where it took him. And really, that kind of boils down the point I want to make in this lesson. If we are truly followers of God, not just nominal followers by saying, yeah, I'm a Christian, but then when times get tough, we fall apart. Not that we aren't apt to do that at times. I fall apart as good as the rest of them. Ask my family. But if we are truly followers of God, then we are called to live out the same principles of our faith today. Whether we're in the middle of good times, times of plenty, or in the middle of a famine, and nothing good seems to be around the corner. Others should see the difference Jesus makes in our lives by the way we respond to our circumstances, whether good or bad, in times of plenty or in times of want. Potiphar put him in charge of his household. It says in verse 4, as I continue and we wrap this up, and he entrusted him to his care, He entrusted to his care everything that he owned. So everything Potiphar had, he said, you take care of it, Joseph, because it always seems to work out for the good. Verse 5, from the time he put him in charge of his household and of all the things he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. I love that part. I'm just going to worry about my stomach. You take care of everything else because it's working. The Lord was with Joseph. Joseph was trusting in God. Joseph's ordeal was probably worse than any of us have ever gone through, and hopefully worse than what any of us will experience in life. Yet God did not abandon him there in that low place, not in the pit. He got him out of that. Not in his low position of slavery, and more things to come that we'll be looking at in the following weeks. God did not abandon him, even in the smallest way. He was there with him through it all. If God allowed Joseph to be a slave, then he would be a successful man, even as a slave. That was God's promise. So often we can complain to God that he puts us in a terrible place or a difficult place, that he could be unfair to us at that moment, that this is just too hard. Yet God's will is that we trust him to bless us and make us successful. Again, that is as he measures success wherever we are. So when you find yourself in a foreign land, and maybe you're not going to be in Egypt, but maybe you're just going to be outside of what you thought was going on, and the world gets turned upside down and everything just seems to be foreign. What am I going to do now? How am I going to handle this? When you find yourself in that place, that land of unknowing, and you feel like a slave to your own circumstances, do as Joseph did. Don't lose hope. Don't lose faith. Just keep walking with God, trusting in him, moving forward in the grace that he gives you, because it is sufficient. We have to remind ourselves of that. His grace is sufficient. And his plans are to bless you, to make you a success, so that you can be a blessing to others. That's his will for you. Maybe he has you in a place right now that feels like the pit, or feels like you've got no control over your situation. Maybe he has you in a place like that to sand off the rough edges, so he can look at you then and say, now you look a little more like my son. That's a good thing. Good thing. Let's bow together. Dear Heavenly Father, wherever we are, let us always know that you are with us, that we can trust you. Give us the strength to serve you right where we are, faithfully, to not lose hope, not to give up, but simply to trust you as we walk one step at a time in your grace. We pray, amen. All right, let's turn to our closing hymn. If you can, let's stand together